Notice that when you're exercising or you're active, your respiration rate increases. Why does it do that? Yeah, are you thinking oxygen? Of course. What does oxygen have to do with it? As you are active, you're using more ATP. So your body, your cardiovascular system, and your respiratory system have to respond in order to get more oxygen out to body cells so that you can replenish those stores of ATP. So at rest, you use much less oxygen. When you're active, you've got to have more. So there are mechanisms that help to match your breathing rate to meet that metabolic demand. So the respiratory center is located in the brainstem. Now let's think about what's happening here. The size of your thoracic cavity is altered by the action of your breathing muscles, which contract as a result of nerve stimulation. That's transmitted from centers in the brain, and then those muscles relax when those nerve impulses stop. These nerve impulses are sent from clusters of neurons that are located in the brainstem. This group of neurons is called the respiratory center. There are two primary respiratory centers. You have a pontine respiratory center located near the pons, and then you have the medulla oblongata, which houses the medullary respiratory center. So the medullary respiratory center is made up of two collections of neurons called the dorsal respiratory group, DRG, and the ventral respiratory group, VRG. During normal breathing, the dorsal respiratory group generates impulses to the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. When the nerve impulse reach those muscles, the diaphragm and the intercostals, the muscles contract and inhalation occurs. In the ventral respiratory group, there's a cluster of neurons that's believed to be important in the generation of the breathing rhythm. So very much like the pacemaker of the heart, setting that basic breathing rhythm. And again, when I ask you to hold your breath, what happened? You built up CO2, and it was these centers within your brainstem that stimulated that diaphragm to contract and those intercostal muscles to contract, and you ended up pushing out that CO2, right? You had to breathe because the brain took over. So the activity of the respiratory centers, though, can be modified in response to input from other brain regions, also from receptors in the peripheral nervous system and other factors in order to maintain the normal homeostatic breathing mechanisms. The cerebral cortex has connections with the respiratory center, so we can voluntarily change our breathing pattern. We can hold our breath and refuse to breathe, but only for a short period of time. Voluntary control is protected because it allows us to be able to go underwater or to hold our breath if we're in a smoke-filled room or somewhere with irritating gases and prevent all of that from entering the lungs. The ability to not breathe, though, is limited by the buildup of that CO2 and the hydrogen ions. Remember, they're going to combine to create that carbonic acid in the body. So when carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions concentration increase to a certain level, the dorsal respiratory group neurons in the medullary respiratory center are going to be very strongly stimulated, and nerve impulses are going to be sent along the phrenic nerve and the intercostal nerves to your inspiratory muscles so that breathing resumes, whether you want it to or not. We've all seen the kid that's pitching a fit for a new toy in Walmart, right? Mama, if you don't buy me that toy, I'm going to hold my breath till I die. Well, they may try, but they're not going to die. They may hold their breath long enough to faint, but as soon as they do, or even for a few seconds, lose consciousness, breathing is going to resume. The nerve impulses from the hypothalamic and the limbic system also stimulate the respiratory center, and they can cause emotional stimuli to alter breathing sometimes when you're laughing or when you're crying. Another way that respirations can be altered is through chemoreceptors. So certain chemical stimuli can alter how quickly or how deeply we breathe. The respiratory system functions to help maintain proper levels of CO2 and oxygen. So it's really responsive to changes in the levels of these gases in body fluids. Chemical receptors called chemoreceptors, known as central chemoreceptors, are located in the medulla oblongata. Located near the medulla oblongata. They respond to changing levels in hydrogen ions or CO2, or even both in cerebrospinal fluid. Peripheral chemoreceptors are located in the aortic body, so there are clusters of these chemoreceptors that are in the walls of the aortic arch, and in the carotid bodies, which are in the walls of the left and right carotid arteries. So these chemoreceptors are part of the peripheral nervous system, and they're sensitive to changes in oxygen, in partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of CO2, and hydrogen ions in the blood. Once these detect those changing levels, that information can then be sent to the respiratory centers, and the rate and depth of breathing can be altered to either get rid of more CO2 or to hold more CO2. Now remember, because CO2 is very lipid soluble, it diffuses, it diffuses easily into the cells and combines with water to form that carbonic acid. Carbonic acid, again, is unstable, so it breaks down to release hydrogen ions and bicarb ions. So if there's an increase in CO2, it's going to cause an increase in hydrogen ions as that carbonic acid breaks down. That change in pH, that decrease in pH, is dictated by those chemoreceptors. Now, if you have a decrease in CO2, that's going to cause a decrease in carbonic acid formation, a decrease in hydrogen ions, so pH rises. So even if there's only a slight increase in the partial pressure of CO2, a condition called hypercapnia can develop. And this is where those chemoreceptors are stimulated and they respond very vigorously. Okay, sorry, I realized I didn't get that slide changed quickly enough. I got to talking about the CO2 levels. All right, so the last thing I mentioned before I remember to change the slide was that even slight increase in the partial pressure of CO2 can occur, and it causes a condition known as hypercapnia, and that stimulates those central receptors, which will alter the rate of breathing. These chemoreceptors are going to participate in a negative feedback system that's going to help regulate CO2, oxygen, and hydrogen ions in the blood. As a result of that increased CO2, decreased pH, remember that increase in hydrogen ions, or decreased partial pressure of oxygen, input from the chemoreceptors causes the dorsal respiratory to become very highly active, and the rate and the depth of the breathing increase. Rapid, deep breathing called hyperventilation allows the inhalation of more oxygen and the exhalation of CO2 until your CO2 and hydrogen levels get back to normal. So think about what happens if you're breathing out lots and lots of CO2. That's what we call hyperventilation. You're crying, you're upset, you're breathing very fast. Well, what do they tell you to do? Somebody say, here, breathe this paper bag. When you're breathing back into that paper bag, you're rebreathing that carbon dioxide. So you're raising that carbon dioxide level back to normal. So if arterial carbon dioxide part, that's a condition called hypocapnia. The chemoreceptors are not stimulated, and the stimulatory impulses are not sent to the dorsal respiratory group. So that results in those neurons setting their own very slow, moderate pace until CO2 accumulates and the partial pressure gets back to normal. As a result, people who hyperventilate voluntarily cause hypocapnia, and they can hold their breath for a longer period of time than normal. So some swimmers used to be encouraged to hyperventilate just before diving in competitions. Now, this practice is risky, though. Oxygen levels can fall dangerously low, and that can cause fainting before the partial pressure of CO2 rises back enough to stimulate to inhale. If you faint and you're standing up on ground, no big deal. You might get a lump or a bruise, but if you faint in the water, you're going to drown. Hypoxia is when the oxygen is deficient at the tissue level, so not enough oxygen is using out into body tissues. This can be caused because you have low oxygen, partial pressure of oxygen in your arterial blood. That can result from increase in altitude. When you increase in altitude, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere decreases. Therefore, when you breathe in, you're receiving less oxygen. This should take you back to the endocrine system when you learned about EPO. Also, if you have an airway obstruction or fluid in your lungs, this decreases the amount of oxygen that's getting out to body tissues. So let's look just briefly at some different types of hypoxia. So hypoxia, again, hypo is under, oxia, condition, oxygenation. So it's a deficiency of oxygen at the tissue level. Based on what causes it, we can classify it into one of four types. Hypoxia, sort of redundant there, right, is caused by a low partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood. This is a result of the high altitude airway obstruction or fluid in the lungs. Anemic hypoxia, there's too little functioning hemoglobin present in the blood. And remember, it's the hemoglobin that binds to that oxygen, so less oxygen is transported out to body tissues. So some of the causes of this may be hemorrhagic anemia, bleeding, other anemias such as aplastic or sickle cell or pernicious, anything that changes how much oxygen is being carried. It can be the failure of the hemoglobin to carry its normal oxygen, such as when carbon monoxide is bound to those hemoglobin molecules. Ischemic anemia is when blood flow to a tissue is extremely reduced so that very little oxygen is being delivered out to those tissues, even though the partial pressure, oxygen, and oxyhemoglobin levels are normal. So plenty of oxygen in blood, it's just not reaching the tissues. And histotoxic hypoxia, blood delivery of oxygen is adequate, but the tissue can't use it properly. This is usually because of some toxic agent, such as cyanide poisoning. So cyanide blocks the enzyme that's required for oxygen to be used to form ATP, so the tissues become hypoxic. So this is just showing a negative feedback example of the regulation of blood pH. So the stimulus is increased pH. Right, so increasing arterial CO2. This is decreasing your pH. So you've got too much CO2. That decreases pH and may also cause or be a result of decreasing oxygen. So the chemoreceptors in the medulla are going to be stimulated, and your peripheral chemoreceptor in the aorta and the carotid arteries will be stimulated because they are chemoreceptors and they detect the changing or decreasing pH. So the input sends nerve impulses to the respiratory group in the medulla oblongata, which is going to send nerve impulses out to your diaphragm and to your intercostal muscles that are to cause more contraction. So hyperventilation occurs. We breathe faster so that we exhale more CO2. What does that do? Decreases arterial blood partial pressure of CO2, causes an increase in pH as we form less carbonic acid, and increases the partial pressure of the oxygen and returns us back to homeostasis. Next few slides are going to take us through a summary of the things that we looked at that can alter breathing rate and depth. So be sure as you go through these tables to look at your increasing breathing rate and depth or decreasing. Again, you know I'm not going to read slides to you. These are here to provide you a summary. And then you have second one, increasing breathing rate and decreasing breathing rate. These include several factors that we really cover very much, such as the limbic system. Your limbic system is your emotional system, so thinking about something or an emotional anxiety can stimulate that dorsal respiratory group and increase the rate and depth that you're breathing. Increase in body temperature can increase the rate of breathing as you need to get more oxygen out to those tissues with the higher metabolism. When you're in pain, you can have a somatic the somatic pain can increase your breathing rate. Stretching of anal sphincter. That one's interesting. Causes an increase in breathing rate and is sometimes used to stimulate respiration in a newborn baby or in someone that stopped breathing. When you have something that irritates your airways, so you breathe something in, whether it's something that you aspirated as someone startled you and you got a piece of your food or some of your beverage into your pharynx or your larynx, or you breathed in chemicals that have irritated those passageways, that can bring about a very quick stopping of breathing that's then followed by coughing or sneezing to try to get rid of those products that are causing the irritation. And then blood pressure. So your carotid aortic baroreceptors can detect changes in blood pressure and then have a small effect on breathing. So a sudden rise in blood pressure typically decreases the rate of breathing, and a drop in blood pressure tends to increase the rate of breathing. And let's see if we have one more slide here. All right, we'll begin a new video with exercise.